It began on a quiet November morning in a small American town, a kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever changed. The sun was barely rising, brushing the sky with faded orange light, when a few commuters noticed something strange near the old train station. There, sitting by the ticket booth, was a black Labrador mix. His fur was thick but matted, his eyes dark and steady, fixed on the platform as if expecting someone. He didn't move when the first train arrived. He didn't bark, didn't beg for food. He simply sat there, waiting. That morning, the station guard thought he must have been left behind by a traveler. But when evening came and the last train rolled away, the dog was still there, his body curled beside a bench, the cold wind rustling through his fur. The next day he appeared again, same spot, same stare, same quiet patience. People began to talk. "Whose dog is that?" someone asked. "Maybe someone lost him," another said. But the station staff noticed something else. Every morning, right before the 8:15 train, the dog would stand up, look toward the arriving passengers, wag his tail faintly, and then sit again when no one came. It was as if he was waiting for a familiar face, a voice he could never forget. Days turned into weeks, and he became part of the station's rhythm. The cafe owner across the street began leaving scraps of food and a bowl of water near the bench. The janitor placed an old blanket for him to sleep on. A schoolboy who passed by daily started calling him Shadow, because the dog followed the sunlight that stretched across the platform but never crossed the yellow line, as if he was guarding something invisible. As winter approached, snow began to fall, covering the world in soft white silence. Still, Shadow remained at his post. Commuters watched from inside the warm train cars, hearts heavy as they passed by the sight of that lonely figure sitting in the snow. His coat had grown dull, his eyes older, but his posture never changed. He was waiting for someone. Rumors started to spread. Some said Shadow had belonged to a man who used to commute every day and died suddenly in an accident. Others said his owner was a traveler who never returned home. No one really knew, but in that little town, everyone began to quietly root for him. They hoped, maybe one day, the person he waited for would step off that train and call his name. One evening, a journalist from a nearby city came across the story. She stopped by the station, camera in hand, and watched him sit as the train arrived. She filmed as people walked past, as Shadow stood, eyes searching the faces, and then quietly laid back down when no one came. Her article, titled "The Dog Who Waits," was published the next day, and suddenly, Shadow was no longer just a local mystery. Letters and food packages began to arrive at the small station. People from neighboring towns drove hours just to see him. Some cried when they looked at him, feeling something deep inside their chest they couldn't explain. Shadow didn't understand the cameras or the visitors. He only cared about the sound of that whistle every morning, that single hope that maybe, today, his person would finally return. As weeks became months, the station adopted him in their own quiet way. The staff built him a small wooden shelter beside the bench. On colder nights, the cafe owner brought him inside for warmth. But even then, when the 8:15 train approached, Shadow would rise, tail wagging gently, and walk to his spot by the platform, staring down the tracks with unshakable devotion. People often said that if love had a form, it might look like that. A dog who refused to give up on someone he loved, no matter how many seasons passed. As the months slipped quietly into years, the story of Shadow became something far more than just a tale of a lost dog. It became a mirror of loyalty, of patience, of that rare kind of love that doesn't fade with time. The little town that once pitied him now revolved around his quiet ritual. The station's 8:15 train was no longer just a schedule, it was a daily moment of hope. Children waved to him from the windows. Commuters paused before stepping onto the platform to drop a gentle pat on his head. Even strangers who had never met his owner found comfort in watching his steadfast devotion. Every morning, as the first light touched the tracks, Shadow would rise from his blanket, stretch, shake the frost from his fur, and take his place by the yellow line. The soft rumble of the approaching train always made his ears lift, his tail wag faintly. And when the doors opened, his eyes would search, always searching, for a face that never appeared. When the crowd cleared, he would sigh, circle twice, and settle again, his chin resting on his paws. Over time, people began to leave little gifts. Someone tied a blue ribbon around his collar. Another person left a small toy beside his shelter. There were cards, flowers, even letters addressed simply to Shadow, the dog who waits. The cafe owner, Mrs. Lillian, who had once thought of him as a stray, now called him her old friend. She would tell new visitors, "He's been waiting longer than most marriages last," and her eyes would glisten every time she said it. During the spring, the park behind the station bloomed with life. Children played, couples strolled, and yet Shadow never strayed far. He would wander just enough to feel the sun on his fur, to sniff the air heavy with blossoms, and then, like a soldier returning to his post, he'd go back to his spot by the bench. His loyalty had become a quiet spectacle. People came to draw him, photograph him, feed him, and talk to him as though he could understand their stories. In a way, he did. He had a kind of calm presence that made people confess things they never told anyone. The town began to rally around him in unexpected ways. When the mayor heard about Shadow's growing fame, he ordered a small wooden sign to be placed beside his bench that read, "Shadow's place, please be kind." Tourists began taking photos beside it. Local artists painted murals of him on cafe walls. He became the symbol of faithfulness, a legend in fur. But behind that fame was the same quiet truth. Shadow didn't understand fame. He didn't understand kindness or pity or attention. He only understood waiting. Every person who tried to take him home found the same thing. No matter how far they brought him, no matter how comfortable the bed or how warm the house, he would escape and return to that platform by dawn. It was as though a piece of his soul was tethered there, bound to a promise only he remembered. There were harsh winters and bright summers, seasons that turned the landscape from white to green to gold, but Shadow never changed. The station workers would often take turns checking on him, worried that one day the cold would finally take him. Yet every morning they found him alive, sometimes thin, sometimes limping, but always there, his eyes still watching, still hoping. The local newspaper followed up with a feature every year. Shadow's still waiting. Readers sent donations for his food, blankets for his shelter, and prayers written in tiny letters. He was no longer just a dog. He was a living symbol of faith that refused to die. One summer evening, something remarkable happened. A little girl, no older than 7, sat beside him with her ice cream. She looked at Shadow and said, "You know, my dad says sometimes love doesn't come back, but it doesn't mean it's gone." The dog tilted his head slightly, listening. She smiled and whispered, "You're brave." Then she placed the rest of her ice cream cone in front of him and ran off laughing. That small act of kindness captured the town's heart. People began calling Shadow the guardian of hope. Years passed. His muzzle grew silver, his pace slower. His eyes still carried that same glimmer every morning, but his body began to fail him. Still, he never stopped coming. There were times he limped, times he coughed, but when that whistle blew, he stood up straight, tail wagging faintly, the same way he always did. By now, a decade had almost passed since his first day there. Many who had watched him grow old moved away, but those who remained often said that the station felt empty without him. He was no longer waiting for just one man, he was waiting for all of them, for everyone who had ever lost someone and wished they could come back. One autumn afternoon, as orange leaves swirled through the air, a traveler passing through the station stopped and watched him. "That dog," he said softly to the guard, "he reminds me of something I used to believe in." The guard nodded and replied, "We all used to, until he reminded us again." And so Shadow's story continued, an old dog, a quiet platform, and an entire town learning what true loyalty looked like. By the 9th winter, the little town had come to measure its years not by calendars or holidays, but by the sight of Shadow at his bench. He was old now, his muzzle almost white, his joints stiff, his steps slower, but he was still there. Every morning, when the first whistle of the 8:15 train echoed through the valley, he would lift his head, push himself upright with a faint groan, and stare toward the tracks. Passengers had changed, faces had come and gone, but his routine remained untouched by time. That winter, though, felt different from the start. The temperature dropped early in November, and by December, the sky was the color of steel. The local weather station warned of an incoming blizzard, stronger than anything the town had seen in years. Streets emptied, stores closed early, and even the cafe where Shadow was usually fed shuttered its doors. The mayor sent out alerts urging everyone to stay home, to keep safe until the storm passed. But that morning, when the train pulled into the station, Shadow was there, sitting under the gray sky, snowflakes already clinging to his fur. The station guard, a middle-aged man named Henry, watched from the window. He'd grown used to seeing Shadow every day, but something about that morning troubled him. The dog looked thinner than usual, his breath rising in small clouds of vapor. Henry grabbed his coat and stepped outside. "Come on, boy," he called softly, voice nearly swallowed by the howling wind. "Not today, it's too cold for you." Shadow looked up at him but didn't move. His eyes flicked toward the tracks as if to say, someone might come. Henry sighed and crouched down, offering a biscuit from his pocket. Shadow sniffed it, accepted it gently, then turned his head back toward the empty horizon. "You stubborn old soul," Henry muttered, rubbing his back. He built a makeshift barrier with crates around the bench to block some of the wind, and then went inside. By noon, the sky had turned white. Snow fell in sheets, covering everything. The trains stopped running. Power lines flickered, and the town vanished under a blur of snow and silence. By nightfall, the blizzard was in full force. The wind screamed through the streets, tearing signs from walls, rattling windows, burying cars. Inside their homes, people huddled around fireplaces and prayed it would end soon. And somewhere out there, under that endless storm, Shadow waited. The next morning, when the storm finally eased, the world outside looked frozen in time. Snowdrifts as tall as fences, rooftops heavy under white weight, and a kind of stillness that comes only after nature has shown its strength. The station doors were half buried, the platform invisible. Henry was among the first to arrive, his boots sinking deep as he waded through the snow. "Shadow," he called, his voice echoing through the silence. "Shadow," no answer, only the crunch of snow and the soft moan of wind through the tracks. Panic settled in his chest. For the first time in years, the thought of that bench being empty felt unbearable. He searched the usual spots, the corner near the cafe, behind the trash bins, by the small shelter they'd built for him, but found nothing. Then, just as he was about to give up, he saw it, a small dark shape half buried near the bench. He ran. "Oh God, Shadow!" he shouted. The dog was there, lying curled up in the snow, motionless. His fur was frozen, crusted with ice. For a terrible moment, Henry thought he was too late. But when he knelt and touched him, Shadow's ear twitched. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, eyes half closed, body trembling from the cold that had sunk too deep. Henry didn't think twice. He lifted the old dog into his arms, his own coat flapping wildly in the wind, and stumbled toward his truck. "Hang on, buddy. Just hang on," he kept saying, though he wasn't sure Shadow could hear him. The drive to the town's small animal clinic felt endless. The roads were still covered in ice, and his headlights cut through the fog like weak candles. When he finally burst through the clinic door, the vet on duty, a young woman named Dr. Brooks, looked up in shock. "What happened?" she asked. Henry laid Shadow gently on the table. "It's the station dog," he said breathlessly. "He's freezing to death." The vet and her assistant worked quickly, warm blankets, IV fluids, heating pads. Hours passed. Henry stayed by the door, pacing, praying silently. Every now and then he'd look over, hoping for a sign. Then, just before dawn, Shadow's chest rose a little higher. His paws twitched. His eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. Dr. Brooks smiled. "He's a fighter," she said softly. "He's going to make it." When the news spread the next day, the town rejoiced. People who had feared the worst came to visit him at the clinic, leaving flowers and cards. The local newspaper ran the headline, "Shadow survives the blizzard." Donations poured in for his care. Children made drawings of him surrounded by snowflakes and sunshine. For the first time in 9 years, the people who loved him realized something. They weren't just watching a dog who waited for someone. They were watching a dog who had been waiting for all of them. Henry visited every evening after work, sitting beside the kennel as Shadow rested. "You gave us all a scare," he whispered once, gently scratching behind his ears. Shadow's tail thumped weakly against the floor, a faint but undeniable rhythm. In time, the snow melted, and so did the fear that the storm had left behind. But for Shadow, the blizzard had marked something deeper, a change not in the world around him, but in his own heart. For the first time, he allowed himself to rest, to accept food from gentle hands, to sleep without one eye on the door. The waiting hadn't ended, but the loneliness had softened. Still, when he was strong enough to walk again, and the trains began running once more, Shadow did what everyone both feared and admired. He returned to his place by the platform. The town tried to stop him. The vet advised against it. But Shadow wouldn't be kept away. As the first morning whistle blew, he took his slow, steady steps to the bench, lay down, and stared once again at the tracks stretching into forever. The people understood then. Some promises are too deep to break, too sacred to explain. When the blizzard cleared and Buddy was finally safe in the rescue shelter, his story had already begun spreading across social media. The picture of that golden retriever curled up beside the statue had gone viral. Thousands of people were moved by his loyalty, and donations began pouring in to support the shelter. But beneath all the love and attention, there was one question that no one could answer. Who was his owner, and why had Buddy been waiting there all these years? For the first few weeks, the volunteers tried everything. They scanned for a microchip, posted flyers around town, and even reached out to local vets and animal control records. But nothing came up. It was as if Buddy had simply appeared out of nowhere. Then, one quiet evening, an elderly woman named Martha visited the shelter. Her hands trembled as she held the photo one of the volunteers had shown her, the photo of Buddy sitting under the lamppost during the storm. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "That's Charlie's dog." The room fell silent. Martha explained that Charlie had been a young man in his 20s who used to live on the outskirts of the town. He worked as a truck driver, and every morning, before heading out for work, he'd walk Buddy to that very park. The statue wasn't just any random place. It was where Charlie had proposed to his fiancée years ago. But tragedy had struck on a cold winter night 5 years earlier. Charlie's truck had skidded on the icy highway during a blizzard, the same kind of storm Buddy had just endured, and he never came home again. The town had mourned Charlie's death, but Buddy never accepted it. The day after the funeral, he had run away from the house, slipping out of the backyard gate, and that was the last time anyone had seen him. For years, people occasionally caught glimpses of a golden retriever roaming near the park, but no one realized it was Buddy, Charlie's loyal companion, waiting for the man who would never return. As Martha finished her story, the volunteers were speechless. They finally understood why Buddy always returned to the same spot, why he refused to follow anyone home, and why he'd sit quietly through the harshest weather. He wasn't just a stray. He was a guardian of memory, holding on to the only love he ever knew. That night, the shelter team decided to honor Buddy's story properly. They reached out to local news, and soon the town rallied together to build something special, a small bronze plaque beside the statue that read, "In memory of Buddy and Charlie, proof that love never truly leaves." But even as the mystery of Buddy's past unraveled, there was one final chapter waiting to be written. Because Buddy's story wasn't just about loss, it was about how the love he carried could change lives, even after the man he waited for was long gone. And in the quiet glow of that park, the next part of his journey was about to begin. After the truth of Shadow's story spread across the town, the little park by the old oak tree was never the same again. People from nearby cities began visiting just to see him, the golden retriever who had waited 5 years for an owner who would never return. Children brought flowers, families left dog treats by the statue, and strangers would pause for a moment of silence as they passed, touched by the quiet loyalty of a soul who had refused to give up on love. Shadow, now growing older, seemed content. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone anymore. The shelter had become his home, and every volunteer treated him like family. Despite the warmth and care, time was catching up with him. His walks grew slower, his fur grayer, and sometimes his legs trembled when he tried to stand too long. Yet, every weekend, he still insisted on visiting the park, the same path he had walked for so many years. He would sit beside the statue, close his eyes, and lift his face toward the wind, as if feeling for a familiar presence just beyond it. Some people said they could almost see another figure beside him, the faint outline of a man kneeling, hand resting gently on his head. Whether it was imagination or something more, no one could say. But in those moments, it felt like Shadow and Charlie were together again. One crisp autumn morning, the volunteers found Shadow lying peacefully under the tree, the same spot where he had waited all those winters. His eyes were closed, his breathing calm. He was gone, not in pain, not in fear, but in peace. The town held a small ceremony that weekend. Children from the local school made paper hearts and tied them to the park's fence, and people brought their dogs to pay their respects. It was more than a farewell, it was a celebration of love that had transcended death itself. A few months later, the town decided to immortalize Shadow's story. With donations from across the country, they commissioned a life-sized bronze statue, not just of Shadow sitting alone, but of him beside his owner, Charlie, both looking toward the horizon. The plaque beneath read, "For Shadow who waited without end, for Charlie who never truly left, love is not measured in time but in loyalty." Today, years later, the statue still stands. Every evening, the setting sun glows against the bronze figures, casting long shadows that stretch across the park path. Visitors still stop to read the plaque, often wiping away tears as their own dogs sniff the base of the statue. Some leave flowers, some whisper words of love to their own lost pets, and others simply stand there, silent, humbled by the story of a bond that defied time. And though Shadow is gone, his spirit remains not just in the bronze, not just in the park, but in every heart that's ever known the unconditional love of a dog. His story has become a reminder that no matter how dark the winters, love always finds a way to shine through. Somewhere beyond the clouds, perhaps in a place where loyalty is eternal and every good soul runs free, Charlie and Shadow walk together once more side by side, forever home.